This is an audio production of Hunter of the Setting Sun by N.N. Shepherd. Music by Josiah Fursanetti. Cover art by Levi Bushnell. Editing by Josiah Fursanetti and Levi Bushnell. Read by the author. Hunter of the Setting Sun. Episode 11. He was dreaming of Eva when Catriona woke him. They were young, riding in the back of the hay wagon with other young men and women their age, friends and cousins, lounging in the hay and looking up at the cloudy sky. Farmer Basil always let the young people ride in his largest wagon packed with enough hay for comfort as he drove them from Wythe to Scatter Falls. The falls were a low area where the Argosant River flowed over a series of low shelves that were just high enough to not be considered rapids. At the bottom of the falls, the water was deep and gentle, and the pools that had formed over the years were always pleasant to swim in. The autumn festival, the time of year when Farmer Basil drove the hay cart to the falls and back, was the coldest time of year to swim in the pools and not catch a dangerous cold. Beyond the festival, it would be too cold and dangerous. The hayride was the final hurrah. The road was bumpy and old, and the cart bounced along on the ride back to town, and Emmond lay in the hay near the front of the cart. Eva sat next to him, and his close friends were spread out in various other parts of the hay, sitting next to the girls they liked. Emmond moved his hand under the hay as quietly and carefully as he could, moving it towards where Eva sat. He talked and laughed with the others, pretending to not be doing anything with his hands, and when he finally found her leg, he gave it a small pinch, not breaking from the words he was saying to the group. He glanced at Eva and saw her looking at him, the black circles in her eyes wide, a small twitch of a smile at the corner of her lip. He pinched her again, though more gently this time, and felt very much that he wanted to hold her leg. It wasn't long before her hand found his under the hay, and their fingers entwined quickly and strongly. Then the clouds darkened and the first drops of rain fell, and the boys and girls all screamed and cried out in fake outrage and burrowed under the hay to keep dry. They had dried off from their dip in the water, but there would be no dry towels until they were back in Wythe. The hay worked well and kept them hidden from the rain and from the eyes of their friends. Emmond had never been as close to Eva as in that moment, under the hay in the bouncing cart of Farmer Basil. There was a rush in his body, coursing through him so powerfully that he felt he might burst if something didn't happen. He kissed her underneath the hay, and though it was dry and tasted of straw, she kissed him back, and they held each other. And they rode back, not kissing again, somehow not able to do anything more than just hug, laughing and shouting to their friends as the wagon bumped and rolled into the town, and then Catriona was shaking Emmond's shoulder. He opened his eyes and saw her over him, backwards as she was behind him. The points of her golden braids pointed down, both on right shoulders again. She was smiling. Comfortable floor? Emmond sat up and wiped the sleep from his eyes and then forced himself to stand. He was still wearing his boots from the night before and hadn't a single blanket on him. And somehow he felt like it was one of the better nights of sleep he had in a while. The memory of the hayride with Eva, 2 or 3 years before they were of age to marry, was slipping away, and he let it go, watching as Catriona moved about the bed, tucking the blankets and quilts back into place. She was already dressed for the day in a blue dress and was talking happily as she worked. No sense of her previous night's drinking lingered with her. He has a plan already, and I suppose we'll talk to him together, but it seems a decent way forward as anything I could conjure. Says he knows the preacher too, so that might help things along. Hope it's soon, Emmond, don't you? She stopped her tidying and looked at him, still standing where he was. His hand tingled where he had felt her breath the night before, and the thought of how close he had been to feeling something for her brushed along his mind, and he nearly wished he was out of the room, away from her. Who has a plan? She smiled as though he were thicker than mud. Relevant, of course. We had a constructive conversation this morning. The sleep was gone, and he was fully awake and present. Is that so? The smile slipped a little more, and there was a touch of guilt. We have to work with him, Emmond. He's our only chance. Yes, but you seem content with the arrangement. What good is there to be sour? Have you ceased mourning? She stepped around the bed and slapped him. It was hard, and Emmond could feel the sting rising on his cheeks. He didn't move. Catriona's face flushed with color, and she looked away for a second, ashamed, but her eyes came back with fire just as quickly as they had gone away. Do not assume my pain, she whispered with a terrible urgency. Do not. Emmond stood there as she moved past him and out into the hallway. The door closed, and he stood for a moment just watching the unchanging pattern of the rug. He found his thoughts empty, his mind nowhere at all, void of any emotion. The feeling passed, and he turned and followed Catriona out the door. He could feel a stiffness in his hip and shoulder that weren't there before, but the pain was gone, and as he moved from the room, he hoped it would pass quickly. He stood at the railing, leaning over the balcony, and saw Rosie sweeping up the floor from the night before. She was dressed in a loose-fitting robe that looked far more comfortable than fashionable, and if it wasn't for her bright red hair, he might not have known it was her. The other women were sitting around a table, a man with gray hair among them. His hands were tied together in his lap. Emmond descended the spiral stair and walked to the table, moving past Rose and taking care not to step in the mess. His boots clicked on the wood floor, and the occupants of the table looked at him. It was a somber group, led by the stalwart stare of Catriona at the seat of the table furthest from where Emmond stood. Dixie wore a purple dress fringed in black, her gloved hand holding a teaspoon that she idly turned in a nearly empty cup, and she didn't look up as they neared. Miss Annie wore a high-collared gray dress and an apron that might have been fully white at one point, her gray hair in a loose bun at the top of her head, and a pair of bejeweled spectacles hung on the tip of her nose, long strings of colored gems looped from the stems of the glasses to connect behind her neck. She was busy reading over several sheets of paper, making little silent marks with a black charcoal pen. Horace Relvin winked at Emmond as he took one of the 2 vacant seats at the round table. He wore a white shirt buttoned to the collar with a small pink flower pin on his left breast. He looked very prim and upright, but still at ease as he always had seemed. Just as Emmond was about to speak, there was a creak at the waist-high swinging doors that led into the hotel, and everyone turned to see who was entering. The man who stepped in was hardly recognizable. He looked like any of the other men in that place, cowboys, Dixie called them. His shirt was red-checkered and opened at the collar by a few buttons, a handkerchief hung around his neck, and a light brown hat sat tilted forward on his head. Blue pants and a wide black belt completed the outfit, matching the black boots he walked in on. He raised a hand, tilted the hat back, and smiled. No amount of new clothing could change the man, though, for he stood as Inspector Parker all the same. "How have you recovered so quickly?" Emmond asked, breaking the silence. The sound of Rose's broom started again, and Parker walked forward and took the seat next to Emmond. He leaned back in the chair and only winced slightly. "Must be the clean air," the man said with a smile. "You were right, Emmond. The air in my world is rotten. The doctor said you were healing well, but he made it seem as though you would be under his care for quite some time." Parker shrugged. "He underestimates himself." Then he raised a finger as though it were a gun and pointed at Relvin. "Bang," he said with humor. The servant laughed, but the sound did little to ease the tension at the table. "You are out of your jurisdiction," Relvin said. "I care little about that." "Not anymore," Parker said. Relvin nodded, his green eyes sparkling with a secret only he knew. "To work so hard and so long for those who would betray you," he mused, "says something about the character of a person." "At least I hold to something moral," Parker replied. "Upon whose morality?" "Enough!" They all turned to Dixie. She sat upright in her chair, the teaspoon forgotten. Her eyes were narrow strips of darkness, peering at the group. "You want to spend your hours spitting insults and talking down to each other? Ain't there a better angle to put your energy into?" "Do you wish to return home?" Relvin asked. "What do you need?" Emmond asked, hating that he had to work with this man. Then he thought for a second. "Are there no other ways to return?" A prideful grin spread on the old man's face. "Wouldn't others travel about if there were?" "How do you know that they don't?" Catriona asked, ice in her voice. Relvin shrugged and raised his tied hands to rest on the table. "Would you like to wait around for another person to travel to you, or go in search of one yourself?" "I don't think any of us fully understand how this works, and would like to know alternatives if possible," Emmond said. He wanted to soothe the spite at the table, keeping himself calm in the process. "I am the alternative," Relvin shook his head. "We can do this much quicker than in Sky City. I chose Shiloh because of its location. It has changed some, but the belief is the same." His green eyes glowed, though not with malice, but with excitement. "There is power here, growing power from many angles." "You have a plan?" Catriona asked. Emmond stared at her and saw that she already knew the answer. Of course she did. Hadn't she said as much just minutes before in the room? She had already spoken with Relvin, already knew what he intended to do, knew his plan. She was just leading him now, leading him to where the others were. The man leaned forward now, his hands still on the table supporting him. They were held together as though he were praying, as though the rope wasn't there just beneath his hands, forcing him into that posture. Emmond wondered if he wasn't praying, somewhere in the back of his mind. "Eugene Thomas Douglas," he said with a thin line to his mouth. "Pastor, now preacher of your church here in Shiloh. Eugene was one of my only friends when visiting this world for the first time. It seems so long ago now." His words trailed off, but no one cut in as he was clearly thinking of something and had more he wished to say. When he spoke again, the affection was gone from his tone, but still the passion remained. "There's a tribe north in the mountains, or perhaps beyond if my assumption of the season is correct. Their leader would be well helpful, and certainly Preacher Douglas will have more friends." "And why do we need all of these people?" Parker asked. "Belief," Relvin nearly whispered. "Where there is faith, there is hope. I can see it like a light around all of us, and I can draw from it for strength. I can draw from it for power, and power opens doors." "And these people have belief? Will they help you?" Emmond asked. Relvin sat back, looking pleased with himself. "Of course. Anything to be rid of me." They had decided to split up again. It was Emmond's idea. There was a moment, while Relvin was speaking, that he realized they would all follow the man's way unless someone else spoke up. If someone else could arise to become the leader, then perhaps other interests would surface instead of just Relvin's. For Emmond did not believe that the man truly wanted to help anyone but himself, no matter what he said. He even knew, somewhere within, that the man would kill both he and Catriona if he was given the chance, just to follow his twisted version of purging. His comments about killing his children had stuck with him, and Emmond knew that the man was not to be trusted. Yes, he might be the only way home, but as far as Emmond knew, he and Catriona were just tagging along. They were helpers in Relvin's motivation, and once their use expired, they would be thrown aside. Of course, Relvin knew that both Emmond and Catriona would kill him if they could, and would try to once they were finished with the world hopping, so Emmond couldn't really fault the man for being deceptive. The rare times that he had hunted with other men, it always seemed best for each one to take their own territory, be careful not to infringe on the other's area, and set their own traps and watch, rejoining each other after every couple days. It worked for large game like bear or elk, and Emmond thought it would work for something even larger, Phi and belief. Catriona, Parker, and Relvin had gone to the church in Shiloh to meet with Relvin's friend, Preacher Douglas. From there, assuming the preacher's help was secured, they would travel to wherever the next nearest minister was and bring him to a meeting for the final fallaway. In the meantime, Emmond and Dixie would travel to the young Cooper's farm and seek his help in going north in search of the tribal leader, Wild Fox, another friend of Relvin's. Emmond wasn't sure that Relvin was being honest when he said the leader's name, but Relvin assured him it was true. You couldn't pronounce his actual name, Relvin had said, but that's what it means in his language. Miss Annie and Rosie didn't seem to mind that Dixie would be out again, as she had been quick to volunteer to help Emmond speak with Coop once more. They walked Danny the old horse with them, the lead rope firmly in Emmond's hand. Dixie had changed into a riding skirt and put her hair back into ponytails. The women had found boots for Emmond that weren't the tactical kind Parker had given him, and though they were sharper in the toe, he liked how they made him just a little taller. No weapons had been exchanged at all, and Emmond sorely wished for a knife or spear. A bow would have been superior. They walked beyond the town toward the ranch, the morning sun shining warm. "Why are you invested?" Dixie seemed startled by the question, but the poise quickly returned to her face. "There's hurt in the world, Mr. Sarren, and we want to ease it if we can. Spent so much time easing men that it only seems fair to help a woman out for once." She smiled coyly. "Not that I'm taking the same path, if you catch my meaning." "Yes," Emmond said. "Do they have ladies like us where you're from?" Dixie asked. "How do you mean?" "Whores." Emmond looked at her and then looked back at the road, not liking the sound of that word in her mouth. It sounded bitter, and he didn't like the thought of her referring to herself that way, even though it did fit in a terrible sort of way. "Is that what you would consider yourself?" he asked. "No," she said, "but it don't matter much what I think, does it? People's own inklings go a lot longer in defining a person. Besides, a name is just a name, ain't it? If I'm a companion to some and a whore to others, I'm still doing the same work at the end of the night." "Do you like it?" Emmond asked. "Not much to like," she answered with a chuckle, "aside from the pay. Do you like your work?" He nodded, slowly, thinking back on the clean air of the empty forests, of waking up by himself and seeing the sunrise through the trees, hiding in a blind and listening as squirrels chirped and ran all around, watched as deer pranced and picked their way across his path, sleeping in a bedroll beside a fire, far from the hunting grounds or grazing line of any animals, out in the forest and the mountains, away from the whole world, but at the same time deep within it. "It was my favorite place," he said. "Was?" It was all for her, and that made it worth something. He understood what he was saying as soon as he said it, and knew that he hadn't had that thought before. All life would be different without Eva, without a real, deep reason for doing things. Perhaps this revenge quest of Relvin was the last thing he could do for her. "I don't know what that's like," Dixie said. "Either loving your work or loving who it was for. I haven't had many people to think about in the back of my mind while I'm working." She looked away, and Emmond thought he saw a hint of shame on her cheeks. "I don't think I'm proud of it." The high crossing sign with the 3 stars on it was coming into view, and a pleasant sound of people drifted over the light breeze toward them. Emmond tried to keep his voice as gentle and kind as possible. "Why do you do it?" "I've got nothing else, I guess." "Would you like an alternative?" She looked at him hard, her eyes narrow slits. "I'd like to walk into a tornado and spin until my head spins off, but I don't do that much, do I?" It was a strange thing to say, and Emmond didn't understand any of it. It seemed she could see that on his face as the fierce look slipped away with a laugh, and her shoulders raised, and that confident woman who had first greeted them the night before in the hotel was back, walking alongside him. "Maybe I should be proud of it, Mr. Sarren. I'm good at it. Any of Miss Annie's girls will tell you that, and any of the girls in Fort Winslow or Clay Gulch. Certainly any of the men will tell you that, too." She laughed, and it sounded happy and jolly. "Life's too short to be miserable, Mr. Sarren, even if you hate yourself." They were too close to the corrals for Emmond to give a reply, and he was partially thankful for that. He hadn't gotten a chance to answer her first question about comfort women in his world, but he thought she maybe hadn't fully meant the question. He hadn't gotten a chance to answer her first question about comfort women in his world, but he thought that maybe she hadn't fully meant what she said. Of course those women were there. There likely wasn't a world where there weren't any. 2 short men jogged up to them and scooped off their hats, holding them to their chest and bowing low before Dixie. "Welcome back, Miss Dixie. Happy to have you at the Triple Star again." The second man grinned and just said, "Howdy." "Thank you kindly, Dale," Dixie said with a little curtsy of her skirt. "Is Coop out running somewhere?" "I think he's in the big house," the first man said. His head had shown bald under his hat, but was covered up again. "Want us to put old Danny out to pasture, or do you fancy you'll need him sooner?" Emmond handed the lead rope over to the second man, who took it with a silent smile. "The pasture is fine, thank you," she said gracefully. "I suppose we'll just mosey into the big house then, if that seems fitting to you, Dale." He stepped aside and spread his arms wide, sweeping down and then around. "The ranch is yours, Miss Dixie." She patted his shoulder and then nodded to Emmond. They walked on, just out of earshot from the 2 men. "Coop doesn't let his boys into the hotel. Might be why they're so kind to me. Haven't seen nothing of me to scare 'em off yet." "Maybe they're just good cowboys," Emmond said, trying out the word. She smiled at him and patted his arm. "Maybe." The big house neared, and Dixie waved at the old couple sitting on the porch in rocking chairs. A quilt lay over the lap of the old woman, and the steady clicking of long, pale needles rang as they flashed back and forth in front of her. Accompanying the knitting was the sound of a small shaving knife scraping against hard wood, as the man to her left held a piece of wood in one hand and cut off tiny shavings with the knife in his other. One of those white cigarettes hung from his mouth, and a pair of milky glasses sat tucked against the bridge of his nose. His eyes were invisible behind them. "That you, Miss Dixie?" the old woman called with a warbly voice. "Yes, ma'am," she answered, "coming to make sure Coop stays in line." Both of the old people scoffed at this. "That boy's just like his father, I tell you," the old man said. "Worse," the old woman rebutted. Worse in the ways that matter, the man agreed. Dixie and Eamon moved onto the first step of the porch, leading up to where the old couple sat. But he's doing well with the ranch, Dixie said with a tender smile. The boy knows his way around a herd, make no Tuesday mistake about it, the old man said proudly, just like his old pa in that regard. He's a fine lad, the woman said proudly. I think so, Dixie smiled, and then pushed into the house quickly, not leaving room for any more conversation. Eamon stepped in after her, and they stood in the dimly lit entryway for just a moment. It was a large house, larger than any farmer's house in Dara that Eamon had seen, or in Wythe for that matter, and he thought it certainly deserved the title that all seemed to give it. A row of hooks lined the wall next to them, and a few hats hung there. Dixie tugged at her ponytails and smiled at a picture on the wall opposite the hats. It was of a family standing just in front of a house. Eamon could see that it was the very house they were standing in, but couldn't tell who the people in the family were, not even looking up close. A little golden placard at the bottom of the picture read, Triple Star Ranch, Diego family, and Burton family, 1879. All right, then, Dixie said, and led him away from the picture and into the sitting room of the house. It was empty, but the woman put her hand to her mouth and called, somewhere up toward the ceiling. Coop Diego, I'd have a word if you're not too busy for an old friend. There was a rustling somewhere above them, and a voice, or perhaps two voices, and then silence. Dixie laughed quietly and pointed to the chairs in the sitting room. He'll be down in just a moment. Are you sure it's him? She sat down, making careful to adjust her skirt just right and place her hands folded over her knee. Sure as I'm sitting here, she said. Eamon took a high-backed green chair and found it to be rather comfortable. There was a fireplace in the room with the head of a large deer mounted above it. He counted 16 points total and had just started counting the whiskers sticking out from the nose when a door swung open and the young man stepped out, pushing back loose blonde hair from his forehead. A strange smirk was on his face. You're back, he said. Always a pleasure, Miss Dixie. Coop, I need your help in the mountains. The boy was about to sit down, but stopped just short. He wiped the back of his hand on his chin, though there was no stubble to feel, and he looked between the two, ultimately settling on Eamon. I don't know that I much like your look, mister, he said finally. I have a goal, Eamon said. Miss Annie and Miss Dixie believe you can help, and that means much to me. I trust your hand. What does he have on you? The boy said, looking at Dixie. Say the word and I'll grab an iron quicker than Denver Pete shot those three. We don't need no shooting, not yet, Dixie said with hands raised to calm him. Take a seat, Coop. We just want to talk. The heat simmered from the boy's face, and he sat down, though he seemed the furthest from relaxed as could be possible. He let out a short breath. I'm listening. There's a lot of strangeness in this request, Coop, and that oddity can't be explained quick-like. It might take longer, so you'll have to take that on trust. But there's a man here in town who needs a parlay with Wild Fox, and we know you have plenty of... No chance. It was Coop's turn to cut Dixie off. You can find any other trapper to go up there and find those Indians. Doesn't need to be me. You know the hills, and I trust you, Dixie insisted, and you know the chief. The chief knew my pa, he contended. Dixie pointed at him. He was there at the burying, Coop. Came all the way down for it. Didn't talk to no one but you. Don't forget that kindness so quickly. And that was the last kindness I saw from the tribe, the boy said. His words were darkening, and a shadow had started over his face, clouding his eyes. Eamon didn't like it. How long did you spend up there? Dixie asked. Didn't matter in the end. They helped you through it all, didn't they? Not when it mattered. The boy rancher turned away from her and looked at his feet, ashamed at his outcry. The shame passed quickly, and he looked back to her. I can't ask for help, Dixie, not even for someone else. Not even for me? She sounded hurt. His teeth ground together so loudly Eamon could hear them from where he sat. He felt invisible in that room, and a part of him wished that he was. It's not a short ride, the boy said finally. Eamon looked at Dixie and saw the quick flash of a victorious smile on her face. It quickly vanished, replaced by a far more diplomatic one. I wasn't intending to go, Coop. She tilted her head toward Eamon, but you'll have to take the stranger. The boy looked back and forth between the two of them. I don't like this business, Dixie. She nodded. Neither do I. Two of us might not be good enough, he said, running a hand through his hair again, thinking. If I may, Eamon ventured, feeling a tension in the room. Certainly Parker or Relvin would like to accompany us, I'm certain. 3 would be all right, Coop said. Can you handle a pistol? Eamon looked to Dixie for clarification, but she only gave a hard, quick little nod. Yes, Eamon said with a false confidence that surprised him. No trouble. You ain't carrying one now, Coop pointed out. Eamon shrugged. I was under the impression that this was a friendly town. The boy smiled and nodded. All right, fair is fair. He stood and gave Dixie a hand to help her to her feet. I'll have Vic round up some mounts and bring them round the hotel. You'll supply the goods? Dixie seemed a little surprised. You'll be ready so soon? He shrugged. Ain't much to do here. Why, I wasn't in a hurry to rush out the house. Nothing the boys need more for anyway. A sound broke from somewhere in the house above them, and all 3 sets of eyes turned to the ceiling. There was a small scuttling sound, and then silence. Eamon saw a slightly amused and embarrassed look on the boy's face. Does your gran know you've got a girl here? Dixie asked with a spark in her eye. Coop shook his head. Can't fathom what you mean by that question. Dixie gave a knowing nod and then turned from the sitting room. Eamon followed with Coop close behind. You got any rifles? The boy asked. Eamon nearly opened his mouth to lie again, but Dixie spoke first. Miss Annie has 2. We can supply 1 if that's fine with you. All right, he said behind them. They reached the exit and swung the first door open, just the thin screen door separating them from the outside. The click of knitting needles and the accompanying scrape of the whittling knife on wood sounded from the porch. The sounds were intermixed with the steady creaking of the porch boards as the rocking chair runners eased back and forth. Couple hours, no more, Coop said as they all 3 stepped under the porch. "Half the day's gone, boy," the old man said as soon as he caught sight of Cooper. The boy stepped close to the old woman and bent down to kiss her on the cheek. "Half the hands are staying around," Coop said as he straightened up. "How's the teddy bear, Pa?" The old man sat down, his whittling with a huff, and scowled at the boy. "It's a carp, boy. Mayhap if you had half an ounce of creative space in that empty head of yours, you could see what kind of creature this is." He waved the wooden carving up at him. Eamon didn't comment, but thought that the small thing would be hard to distinguish as a fish, half-finished as it was. He found it best to keep quiet. Coop waved this away and bounded down the steps with Dixie and Eamon in tow. They walked a few strides before the boy slowed down and turned back to them. "Couple hours, I reckon. Should see me riding up to Miss Annie's with the horses." Dixie took his hand and gave it a warm squeeze, and Eamon just gave a small half wave. They turned and walked from the ranch, Dixie waving and greeting some of the ranch hands as they moved about their morning work. "Did you see the girl in the window?" Eamon asked as they crossed under the overhead sign. Dixie nodded with a cheery smile. "I'm surprised you did. When did you notice her?" Eamon had only glanced back at the house once to see the old couple sitting on the porch and had seen a pretty face vanish in one of the upstairs windows. "Coop is just like his father," Dixie said with a pleasant laugh. They walked on for a bit, each with their own thoughts. "How am I to repay the doctor?" Eamon asked finally, breaking the pleasant silence. "What do you owe?" she asked, looking at him sideways. "Not sure. I took Parker in and promised I would pay when he was healed. I haven't spoken to the man since Parker met us this morning. Not sure what the price will be. Despite what Coop Diego thinks, Doc Silas is a fair man. He won't charge what you can't pay, and he won't charge what isn't fair. A good Samaritan, Preacher Douglas might say." "Who's your God?" Eamon asked on a whim. She looked at him, puzzlement clear on her face. "I don't think I have a God." "Who's the God of this land?" "God?" she said, now sounding amused. They turned off the small path and angled on one that went east and north around the back of the town. "What do you call him?" "God," she said again, now with a smile. "Christ, too, I suppose." Eamon mused. She said nothing. "But this God is not yours?" Eamon asked. Dixie opened her mouth to answer, but no sound issued for a few strides. When she spoke, the words were careful and sounded from a deep place. "I don't think I'm his." Eamon nodded, knowing the feeling too well. The small white church came into sight. It stood away from the edge of Shiloh on a small hill with a single pine tree next to it. The steeple rose maybe half up the height of the tree and was spotted with gray. As they neared, Eamon could tell that it wasn't really spotted, but that roof tiles were simply missing. He wondered how difficult it had been to paint the whole thing white. The small white church in Dara was made almost entirely of stone, white stone from the same quarry that made the Cathars Monastery, and though it had worn and discolored over time, it remained mostly white. There was a small building built on the side of the church, white as well, and a sign near the front steps leading up to the double-arched doors said, Bethany Chapel. Dixie stopped short of the front steps and looked up at the sky. Eamon stared up after her. All was blue, not a single cloud could be seen, nothing but clear azure. A bird soared high overhead, and another followed. "What are you looking for?" Eamon asked. "Checking for lightning," she replied, then entered the church. If there was one constant between the worlds, Eamon was learning, it was the structure of the churches. The outside seemed similar, long and square with high-peaked roof and a towering steeple, either at the front or at the back of the building. Arched double doors with big knockers and a small welcome room before the sanctuary. Then, 2 rows of benches, some with backs, some without, all square and in a line, with an aisle down the middle leading to a raised platform and a pedestal at the center. Something was carved there, or a cloth with colors and symbols hung there, but it was always the focal point. And behind the lectern there might be a door to a small anteroom in the back, and usually there was a large symbol high on the wall at the back of it all. This church was no different on the outside. The inside was empty. There were no pews or benches, no well-cleaned floor, and no stained glass windows letting in colored light. No sign of an open hand or a wheel or a cross on the high wall above it all at the back, and no raised pulpit standing up in the middle to hold a book or a scroll or some other religion's artifact or relic. It was bare, empty of all life and all things that might make it a holy place. Eamon stood in the center of the place, looking about slowly, feeling an emptiness that he wasn't expecting. He used to find peace in the house of the potter, or at least reverence, and though he wasn't the most regular attendee, there was a radiance in that building he couldn't deny. There was something almost tangible about the power in that white stone building, and even after the betrayal of the man of God, the servant of the hand, Eamon still knew there was a thing greater than himself in the world, and that power had a home, or, at least, gathered with believers where they were. Here, there was nothing. Dixie walked past him to the small angled alcove at the back of the church, putting her hand to the narrow door that stood there. She looked back at Eamon with a nearly patronizing look on her face. "It's just a building, mister," she said. "Come on." She pushed into the doorway and disappeared. Eamon followed slowly, looking at the coverings over the windows, wondering how he hadn't noticed the lack of stained glass from the outside. The church was old. That was apparent through the wood and the missing pieces of the steeple's roof, so there was no excuse for it being in the process of construction. No, it just seemed in disrepair, abandoned. Hadn't Relvin said this place was full of spiritual life, or belief in a higher power, of what he called Phi? How could it be so if their place of worship was so forlorn? He forced himself to move and followed Dixie to the door, and then pushed it inside. Instantly, he was in another place, a world that wasn't old and forgotten, a place that was lived in and cared for and comfortable. Happy voices carried across the space, the smell of warm food wafted toward him, and he found a sense of cleanliness that he hadn't felt since he had last come home to find Eva scrubbing away at the floorboards of their house, the entire place shimmering and glowing. His sense of loss from moments ago were suddenly and forcefully replaced by those of homesickness and the hurt of his dead wife. It was a rushing conflict of feeling that nearly took his legs from him, but he managed to lean against the wall of the small walkway between buildings and close his eyes, holding his breath and forcing the memories to go away. It hurt so, pushing her smiling face from his mind, the love she had for him glowing so brightly. Emmond? It was her voice in his head, and it nearly broke him. His name was said again, and clearly it wasn't Eva, and he pulled himself from the daze. The attached house was quaint and clean, but it was cramped and didn't afford much space. Only one room that he could see, a corner with a stove and a fireplace and a table, and another corner with 2 small cushioned chairs and a final corner with a bed, the blankets and sheets folded and tucked in properly. Parker sat on the edge of the bed, leaning toward the table where Relvin and a man in a black shirt sat, steaming mugs of something pleasant smelling between them. A woman in a plain dress stood at one of the cushioned chairs. A bag with knitting needles and strings of yarn hanging out of it sat on the short table in front of her. Dixie and Catriona stood next to the woman, though Catriona had taken several steps forward, and when she spoke, he knew that it was clearly her words he had heard in his mind. "You look terribly pale, Emmond," she said. Her eyes held genuine concern. Emmond nodded feebly, then swallowed hard and nodded more firmly. "I am well," he said, not wanting to explain any further. The others in the room took it without question. The man in black stood and crossed the small room to where Emmond was. He already appeared young, perhaps younger than Emmond by 5 years, but he walked with a crispness to his step that gave him the lithe appearance of a man 10 years younger. His hair was short and combed to the side, much how Parker wore his, and a small mustache donned his upper lip. He reached out a hand and shook Emmond's, clasping his arm with his other hand. It was a firm shake that held friendship, and Emmond instantly liked the man. "Preacher Douglas," he said, smiling, introducing himself. "Emmond Sarren." "Yes, I've heard much about you." He turned and gestured to a smiling Horace Relvin. "So kind of you to travel with him, help him along his path. I would be most happy to help you return to your wife and children." Emmond opened his mouth to speak, or laugh or scream, but he saw the look on Parker's face, looked to Relvin and saw a similar look, and closed his mouth. Rage boiled under the surface, and though he couldn't understand the lie, the face of his unlikely compatriots was enough to maintain it. "Yes, I'm very much looking to return to my family. Thank you for being willing to help." "Are you a follower of our God?" Emmond shook his head, though realized that he wasn't entirely sure. "I believe the potter created all and controls all from his wheel." The smile widened on the man's face, and his voice was full of joy. "Your potter and our God are the same." The preacher turned back to the room, smiling still. "I will travel to Fort Winslow and bring Father Aaron back with me." Relvin smiled a fatherly smile and rose, clasping the young preacher on the shoulder. "You have grown so much, friend," he said. "I am more than pleased to see you again. I look forward to returning and praying with you." "I'll be praying while we travel," the man said. Parker stood as well, looking as though he had never survived gunfire from flying machines in a futuristic world just 2 days before. His face was grim and cold, the smiling look that was there when Emmond first entered showing clearly as a facade. Relvin walked to the woman standing at the chair and gave her a hug, a caring hug it seemed, and let her kiss him on the cheek. The men then walked from the house via a side door and out into the fresh open air. "It looks well repaired since the fire," Relvin said, turning back to look at the whitewashed building. Douglas nodded his thanks. "Yes, slowly and steadily, and with the grace of God. Rebuilding the pews and the cross will take time, but so far the people have been cheerful about bringing their own seats. The fellowship of the Lord cannot be halted by war or disease." "Nothing can stop the truth," Relvin agreed. "How long is your journey to your friend in Fort Winslow?" Parker asked. Preacher Douglas looked to Relvin for translation. Once he had repeated the question, the man smiled. 3 days' ride, there and back. Perhaps 4, depending on the conditions along the river, and I suppose longer if it takes time to convince him. He said this last with a joyful smile. Truly, Emmond thought this was a man who lived without anger or complaint. Relvin and he shook hands, and the man waved kindly to Parker and Emmond. Dixie exited the house as well, and he smiled at her. They walked away, up north from the path to the main road that went west into Shiloh. Parker and Catriona stopped, and Emmond and Dixie did as well. Somehow, without attempting to, the 4 of them had made a circle around Relvin, standing in the center alone. He turned about slowly, smiling the whole time. "This is where you kill me, outside a church just before our plan begins to take shape?" "What lies are you telling that man?" Emmond asked. "Plenty," Catriona said. "He's a different man to everyone, but no one real to anyone," Parker added. Suddenly, the pleased look slipped away from Relvin's face like the sun might hide quickly behind a cloud. His lip curled in a snarl, and the handsome fatherly look, with his wrinkled lines and gray hair, disappeared, and he seemed just an angry old man. "You are fools, all of you. These worlds may have the same God, but the rules are not the same." Relvin turned on Dixie. "Such an establishment as your Miss Annie upholds would not last a moment in Emmond's world. Not a moment." Emmond stepped closer to Dixie, afraid that the servant would lash out and attack her. The spite he felt towards this man was returning, or resurfacing, rather, and he suddenly felt the urge to strike him down, weaponless as they both were. Relvin turned to Parker, the angry look on his face turning into a mocking sneer. "You are an experiment, one that should not be performed no matter the technology or advancements of your world." He shot out a hand and pushed at Parker's chest, forcing the inspector to take a small step back. "You're hardly even real." "You are hell," Parker snapped at him. You know nothing of hell, the servant snarled. He turned to Emmond. The things I know and the rules I have followed in other worlds would crush the stalwart soul of the man in that church. You would have me approach him and ask for his help, telling him that I was surrounded by people whose families have been affected at my hand of justice? So you know you are wrong, Catriona cried with bitter triumph. Relvin turned to her. I know you are fools. His voice was low, deadly. Fish abide by laws of their own, opposed to the birds of the air, yet they still live in and inhabit the same world. We are two different worlds. Is it not the same God, then? Relvin turned to Dixie, and Emmond thought that he would reach out and harm her, but he stayed his hand, only staring at her. You know nothing of the infinite nature of the potter, of God, the creator. Is he limited to our definition of sameness? Would you assume to know more than what has been created, what we see among us here? Is lying not a sin? Catriona asked. Yes, he turned to her. Yes, of course, on all worlds, no doubt. And I will make my penance when we return. But first we must return, and subterfuge is warranted. This preacher friend of yours, he believes you to be a moral man? Emmond asked. Relvin turned again. His green eyes met Emmond's, harsh and cold on his heated face. Will we stand here all day and ask about my shortcomings? We don't need to ask, Emmond said. He turned, crossing in front of Relvin and tugging on Dixie's arm. He was less sure than ever if the man wouldn't try to harm the woman for her occupation. The others followed, and they re-entered Shiloh with little speaking. The hotel was empty as it had been when they left, and Emmond climbed the stairs with Catriona to get to their room. Parker agreed to stay and watch Relvin, while Dixie left to find the other hotel women. Emmond sat on the other side of the bed and put his head in his hands. I don't want to work with him, he muttered, more to himself than to Catriona. One hand, then another, touched the top of his head, just resting there, unmoving. Her voice was low and troubled, but came from a place that Emmond could feel deeply. I want to see my children. He looked up at her, and as he did, her hand slid down the side of his face before he pulled away. The touch seemed to linger even after she crossed her arms and stepped back, nearly unaware she was doing it. God, Emmond said carefully, whose side is he on? Does the potter pick sides? She asked. Relvin seems to think so. Relvin isn't the arbiter of all that is true, she said. Emmond nodded and started to stand up, but then decided against it and lay back fully on the bed. It was far more comfortable than the floor. Catriona came and sat next to him, her weight on the bed tilting him just slightly. Emmond's eyes moved from the ceiling to her back, and then quickly to the ceiling again. That strange desire to reach out and find comfort in a touch was there again, and he nearly did so before she spoke, breaking the moment. I won't go north with you to meet with this leader of the tribe, whomever he is. Emmond pulled his hands back underneath his head. That is all right. She turned just enough to look back at him. I want to stay and help the girls here. At the hotel? Do they need help? You've met them, haven't you? Emmond nodded slowly, though the motion was mostly lost in the bed. You can't save them, Catriona. She looked away. I have to save someone. He understood that. Perhaps more than anyone else could, he understood her feelings. So much was lost, so much that could not be replaced. The others had not lost all, had they? Emmond thought of Parker, thought of Coop and Dixie, even thought of Dr. Silas. There was something there with all of them, something that Emmond could feel and hope to amend. No, not before amending his own story. Home and revenge. That was foremost. Of course, by then he would be away from all the others, and their paths would be no more. It was why he understood her desire to help the hotel women, whatever that may mean. We shouldn't be gone long, Emmond said, finally rising from the bed and turning to the bureau. Annie and Dixie had filled it with a small selection of clothing for both Emmond and Catriona, and he took out what was there for him and bundled it together on the table by the window. Be quick, she said, not having moved from the bed. I'm running thin. I know, he said. He left the room, left before he said or did anything that he would regret, but stopped outside the door to let himself have a moment of thought. He knew he could find nightly companionship in this world, in the very hotel in which he was residing, but he also knew how terribly empty it would be. Eva was still fresh in his mind, her touch still flashed across his skin at times and drew the pain to the surface. Catriona was close, maybe as close as someone could be in such a foreign place, and their inextricable linking could not be ignored. She was charming and pretty, and certainly if there was a time before Eva... Emmond closed off the mental wandering, steeled himself to a single thought, that of how he would kill Relvin. He had thought of it before, stabbing him through with his long hunting spear, gouging him down the middle and feeling the drip of the weapon slicing through the flesh. Or perhaps a knife, quick across his throat, severing the thick veins there and spreading blood out along his body. He hadn't thought of it much, it seemed like not for a while, but he found the idea of killing the man enough of a consuming thought to keep from wondering at Catriona. It would never do. He would always think of Eva and always wondered if he truly cared for the widow or if he only turned to her to cover the pain. Closing his eyes for a moment, he let out a firm breath, forced his face into a smile, and walked down to the main floor, thinking of tearing Relvin apart with a pair of shears, even as he sat down at the table where Parker sat, watching the servant. Coop arrived when he said he would, and by then the party had prepared all that they would need for the journey into the mountains. There was an outfitter store 2 shops to the west from the hotel, and Annie had given them some money to purchase food and equipment. They were only planning for a 4-day trip, but the matron had assured them that they would want to be well stocked. You never know what the mountains will give you, she had said, and Emmond agreed. He remembered a time when he was hunting for an elusive elk. He had tracked the creature one winter when the snows were high, but hadn't been able to take it down, though he managed to scar it across the left hind leg. The animal crossed the river and disappeared. Emmond thought he might die in that encounter, such was he ill-prepared for the journey. The elk had led him deep into the northern mountains to a place he would travel to again when he would venture into the Tatterspan, though that venture was much more well-planned. Realizing that the elk would no longer be viable, he began the trek back to Dara. But his food ran thin, and the snows kept most of the animals in hibernation or hidden. The streams were frozen. He hadn't planned to track as long as he had, and was thus understocked. Home had never looked so good. Emmond understood the need to prepare more for what might happen than what they were sure would happen. The general store had a full selection of items they would need, and by the time they returned to the hotel and had their packs prepared, the young rancher was riding up with 3 horses in tow. He hailed them as he dismounted and tipped back his white hat, grinning a youthful grin. He looked more like a boy than he had up to that point. "Howdy," he called, looping the reins of his horse over the tying post. "You look ready for a ride." Parker, Relvin, and Emmond stood on the porch in front of the hotel, their bags before them. Dixie walked from the swinging double doors and past the group on the porch, stepping down to where Coupe Diego was and gave him a quick hug. It had a motherly look to it. She whispered something to him and he smiled, nearly graciously, and when she backed away, his smile widened to cheer again. The men loaded the horses, choosing which they rode at random. Emmond picked a black mount with a white star marking on his forehead, just above his eyes, partially covered by his forelock. With their bags packed, the men turned away from the hotel and stood in the middle of the street, their horses stamping impatiently at the ground or snorting puffs of steam into the air. They seemed even more anxious than the men. The young Diego moved to the front of the group and turned back, looking from Parker to Relvin to Emmond, each in turn. The boy was gone. Here, instead, was a man who had become one much too quickly. "This is my world," he started. "I've spent far too long in the mountains, and I know the tribe's locations." His eyes found Relvin. "You may be Wild Fox's friend, but I am as well. No one but me is to lead. I'm taking you there as a duty to Miss Dixie, not as a duty to you. Comprende?" All 3 looked at him without understanding. "You understand?" he reiterated. The men nodded in near unison. "Let's ride." This has been an audio production of Hunter of the Setting Sun by N.N. Shepherd. Music by Josiah Fursanetti. Cover art by Levi Bushnell. Editing by Josiah Fursanetti and Levi Bushnell. Read by the author. Tune in next time for another episode of Hunter of the Setting Sun.